In this video, I'll explain the process of how I achieved that jet flame effect using various techniques. To achieve this effect, I have used four main tools, which includes the texture deformer, noise textures, a ramp texture, and a lattice deformer. And with all these techniques combined, you get a really nice layered effect. To get the shape of the outer flame, I used a lattice deformer to flare out the ends. Using the texture deformer along with the noise texture, I created a chaotic look. For the two flames on the side, I have two layers. One is the core and one is the exterior shell. Last but not least, we have the center flame, which also is cone-shaped. At the base of the flame, I made it shaped like the thruster's emitter. And it kind of sells that it's a volume instead of just a 2D shape. To start the shape of the outer flame, I quickly selected the rim, the edge loop around the thrusters, and then convert it into a curve. Then I proceed to rebuilding the curve to get even segments. The purpose of this is to assist the loft tool in creating more uniform faces. In the display options, I'm turning on the CV so I can see it more clearly, without the need to go into component mode. Then I proceed to duplicating the curve by using the offset curve function. Keep the subdivision density to 0 so that the duplicated curve has the same amount of points as the original curve. Once I have the two curves, I'm going to select both of them and then loft to create the base geo. Here I'm just increasing the subdivisions. After I'm done tweaking the segments, I start to refine the shape of the outer flame. I use a lattice deformer to flare out the ends. No fancy technique over here, just basically selecting the lattice points and reshaping the flame until I'm happy with the results. Increasing the local influence will allow the mesh to have smoother transition between the lattice points. I have also added some subdivisions to the mesh so that later down the line I will have more geo to work with. Here I'm just reversing the face normals. Next up, we're adding thickness to the geo by extruding to add some volume to the flame. Then I proceed to add a texture deformer to the mesh. I'm adjusting the rotation on the texture deformer by grabbing the handle and rotating it to the direction I want. So in the texture deformer settings, I keep the direction to handle, and in the texture section, I click the checker icon and add a noise texture. Once the noise texture is added, I start tweaking the settings. Change the noise type to Perlin noise, because I find this noise type to work the best for this effect. Currently, the deformation looks a little bit too wavy, so we want to correct that. The main setting to change is the frequency. The higher number the frequency, the more jagged it looks. Under the deformer attributes, I want to add a falloff to control where the noise happens, because I don't want the deformer to affect the entire mesh. Now I'm just moving the falloff control so it's closer to the thrusters. And in the primitive shape, I want to change from object to plane. With the handle selected, rotate it so that it's facing the correct direction. This falloff is meant to limit the effect of the deformer on the specified area. In here, I'm just adjusting the falloff curve by reversing the start and end points. Here, I'm just doing some minor tweaks to the lattice. I'm playing around with the strength to adjust the intensity of the flame. There's not a lot of stuff going on in this portion of the video, but I'm just mainly doing a lot of tweaking back and forth with various settings to get the look I want. Changing the depth max and the ratio will affect the detail of the noise. Moving on to the texturing portion. So first, we gotta deal with the UVs. I open up the UV editor. I then change the pivot of the UVs to the bottom of the UV shell. Scale the UV until it touches the boundary. I'm just gonna apply a standard surface material to the outer flame. The standard surface material is similar to Arnold's AI standard surface. Start with the ramp for the base emission color. Then I start introducing some color into the gradient. For the first color, we're going with a neon type of blue. Then follow up with like navy-ish looking blue, but with more saturation and lighter. Then I'm going to introduce some deeper blue in the middle of the gradient. Here I'm playing around with the settings and the color of the ramp, until I'm happy with the look. Now you may or may not know this. You can actually push the value of the color past 1. But now I'm just focused on the gradient of the color. I'm connecting the gradient into the emission color slot. I'm going to reuse the same ramp in the emission color slot. Once you crank up the emission weight, you can start seeing the glow. Please keep in mind what I'm doing here is not 100% accurate. It's mainly just to make things look cool. It's important to preview these effects from time to time to see if you're heading in the right direction, and also see which settings need to be tweaked. Moving on to the opacity. Under the geometry tab, you'll find the opacity. Add a ramp to the opacity. You want it to be more transparent near the end. In this portion of the video, I'm just shifting the values around until I'm happy with it. I'm going to start with a cube. Reposition it and then scale it after. After I position the cube, I'm doing some extrudes. Then near the tail, I'm going to taper it off. Once I have the overall shape, I then select the edges around the silhouette and bevel it. I'm going to delete the cap on the end because we don't need that. Adding an edge loop here. Making the ends slightly pointier, with soft selection turned on. After that, we move on to the UVs. Doing a basic planar mapping to start. Now I'm just rotating so that the tail is on the bottom and the start of the flame is on the top. Like previously with the center flame, we start with a ramp texture for the emission color. I'm unhiding the flame I created before for reference. Let's move that off to the side so that I can clearly see what I'm doing. With the geo selected, I'm going to add a lattice. It's not visible because I forgot to turn the show lattice back on. I'm going to hide all the other lattices and focus on the current one. I wanted to adjust the shape of the flame, so I increased the subdivision of the lattice, which in turn will give me more points to work with. I'm reshaping the flame with the lattice points. Just gonna reverse the color here because of how the UVs are oriented. Playing around with the opacity ramp so that I get a nice fade on the tail. Trying different interpolation methods to see which one looks best. The pulsating effect of the flame is simply achieved by animating the lattice deformer by scaling it back and forth throughout the timeline. Before I animate, I need to set the pivot of the lattice to the base. Once that's done, we can move on to animation. To make things easier, I simply duplicate the keys by selecting the keys and then copy and paste them. Rinse and repeat and keep pasting the keys until you fill up the timeline. Hitting the play button just to preview how it looks like. So far so good. Moving on to the next step, which is to create the outer shell of the flame. Duplicating the original flame and then selecting the faces near the end and deleting them. With soft selection turned on, I scale the points slightly to flare it out. Again, I'm gonna use the lattice to reshape the flame. I'm using the lattice to extend the flame so that it's longer. Using the multi-cut tool, I'm adding a few more segments to the flame. I'm also going to use the edit edge flow to make the transition smoother. Once I'm done with the edits, I'm going to freeze transform and delete history. And like I've done before, I'm going to use the lattice to animate the pulsating effect. Repeating the same steps by copying keys and then pasting them, because you can just animate the first few frames and then duplicating them to save time. Renaming the material so there's less confusion. Instead of starting from scratch, I'm going to duplicate the existing material to use as a base. Let's move that out of the way so we have a clear view of what we are doing. Gonna introduce some orange color to the ramp. Push the hue slightly to red. Let's add a color composite. I use this node a lot for mixing different colors and textures. Let's add another ramp. Plug it into the color B port. It's acting as a brightness control. Set the operation mode to dodge instead of add. Now I'm going to switch back to the viewport to see how the color looks like. Again, I'm going to fix the UVs. Making a cut here on this edge loop and then unfolding it afterwards. Scale it outwards. You don't have to use the same exact method I'm using right now to straighten the UVs. Here I'm doing a little bit more tweaks to the color. Adding another color composite node. Plug the black and white ramp for the opacity into the color A slot, and then take the out color and plug it into the opacity slot. To get that streaking effect, I'm going to add in a fractal in the color B slot. Solo the color composite so you can see how it looks like when it's combined. Change the operation to overlay. I'm increasing the U value of the repeat UV while at the same time I reduce the V value. Adjusting the V attribute will squash and stretch the streaks. The third ramp is acting as a limiter to the streaking texture. As I move the marker to the left, you can see the streak being cropped. Just trying out different modes to see which looks best. Ended up just using the overlay mode. Not a lot going on in this section of the video. It's just me mainly tweaking the colors and values back and forth until I'm happy with the look. Also, don't forget to animate the texture as well, or it's gonna look a bit strange with the static streaks. Turning off the selection highlighting so I can see things better. To remedy this, simply just go to the time attribute and set some keys. Nothing complicated here, just alternating between different values throughout the timeline. In this last section, I'm just gonna show you how I created the shape of the center flame. Because the shader setup is essentially the same as the previous flames, Starting off with a plane, left click and drag until it matches the width of the thrusters. Then with the multi-cut tool, you add the edges that corresponds to the grill. Holding on to shift and then with the scale tool, I extrude the edges until it fills out all the gaps. I cheated a bit here by using a mirror tool to mirror the left side over the right side. With the border selected, I'm gonna do an edge extrude. Here I'm using a plane to create the tail end of the flame where I could bridge to it, instead of just extruding all the way and then tapering it off and then collapsing the faces and vertices. Since bridging requires the same amount of edge, I'm going to use the poly count display option so that I can tell how many edges are on the border and then match it with the plane by adjusting the subdivision amount of the width and the height. This will in turn create a nicer topology. Once I have the same amount of edges, I'm going to select both meshes and then combine them and delete history. Next, I select the border edges and then run the bridge tool. Adjust the divisions and then change the curve type to blend. Since sometimes Maya will lose the shader on the faces, I'm going to reapply the Lambert one to the whole mesh. Then I start shaping the tail end of the flame by using soft selection. Here I'm just continuing shaping the flame until I'm happy with it. I'm also using average vertices to smooth out certain areas. Edit edge flow is also a very useful tool in smoothing out the transition between sections. Recently, I picked up a new technique using the delta mush as a relaxed deformer. First, you gotta turn down the displacement to 0 and then increase the smoothing step to start seeing an effect. Nothing exciting here, just tweaking the shape more. I'm also using a lattice to create a sharper tip. Don't be afraid to use the sculpting tools to help you shape your geo. In my opinion, the sculpt tool is also quite useful for hard surface objects as well. After running a flood with the smooth operation, the topology is slightly uneven now, so I'm going to run a mirror so that I have even topology on both sides. Here I'm just smoothing out the transition so I get a nicer fall off. Since the shading and the animation is using the same techniques, I will not show it again here. And this concludes the video. Thanks for watching. Until next time on Maya Quick Tips.